The year was 1875, deep in the unforgiving lands of the Arizona Territory, where the last echoes of the Apache Wars still rumbled like distant thunder. Settlers spoke in hushed tones about ambushes on lonely trails, soldiers vanishing in the mountains, and treaties broken as swiftly as they were signed. Out here, trust was rarer than rain. Jonathan Hale knew that truth better than anyone. For 10 long years he had lived alone at the edge of the high plains, a man carved hollow by loss. His wife and young son had been claimed by a winter fever no doctor could stop, their graves resting beneath 2 wind-worn stones behind his cabin. Since that day, Jonathan built fences high and his heart higher still, speaking little to the townfolk who called him the old wolf on the ridge. But at dawn that morning, silence heavier than any storm pressed against his weathered cabin. There were no birds, no whisper of dry grass, not even the sigh of desert wind. It was the kind of silence that carried death. Jonathan stood motionless by the window, a chipped tin cup of cold coffee shaking in his calloused hand. And then he saw them. Across his rotting fence line, stretching as far as his eyes could reach, stood 200 Apache warriors. Their faces were painted in fierce colors, bodies still as stone, eyes burning like coals in the pale light. They did not move, they did not speak. They only stared at the lone cabin pressed against the cliffs, as though the earth itself had delivered their judgment. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He had known Apache raiding parties in his soldiering days, had felt the crack of arrows and the bite of bullets in the desert, but never had he faced silence. He knew well enough that noise and fury could be survived. Silence was far deadlier. And he knew the reason they had come. The night before, in the teeth of a raging storm, he had opened his barn doors to a woman staggering through sheets of rain. She was half collapsed, her dark hair plastered against her face, her breath ragged with fear. He had given her shelter, wrapped her in a wool blanket, and, without hesitation, pressed into her trembling hand his father's old silver dagger. It was the only relic left from the war, but he had placed it there out of simple mercy, telling her to keep it until the storm passed. She had looked at him with eyes that carried both fire and sorrow. Then, before dawn broke, she vanished into the night, leaving only footprints in the mud. Now, as Jonathan stared at the ranks of painted warriors, he understood what his mercy had cost. That woman was no ordinary wanderer. She was Ioka, wife of Ironhawk, the Apache chief whose name was spoken with both reverence and fear across the territory. And 200 warriors had come to demand an answer. Jonathan drew a long, steady breath and closed his eyes for a moment. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Psalm 23:4. Then he set down his coffee, gripped the doorframe, and stepped out into the silence that could decide his fate. Jonathan's boots creaked against the wooden porch as he stepped out into the cold light. The desert sun had only just begun its slow climb, yet the air was already dry enough to burn the throat. Before him, the warriors did not shift, not even to blink. Horses snorted and pawed the earth restlessly, but their riders remained statues, painted faces unreadable. For a long moment, the old soldier said nothing. He was no fool. One wrong word, one twitch of the hand, and this quiet dawn would become his grave. The memories of the night before still clung to him like wet clothes. The storm had torn the sky apart with thunder and forked lightning, a fury as if the heavens themselves had declared war. Jonathan had been wrestling with the stable doors when he first saw her, a figure staggering across the prairie, fighting against the wind as though each step might be her last. When she collapsed at his fence line, Jonathan had rushed forward. Up close, he saw the sharp lines of her face, her dark eyes wide with both defiance and terror. Her dress of tanned leather was torn by thorns, soaked through by the downpour. She had tried to wave him away, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I cannot stay. My people, they will worry." But her body betrayed her, trembling in near collapse. Jonathan remembered his mother's words long ago, before sickness took her away.
When you see someone in need, do not ask who they are. Offer your hand." And so he had. He had guided the woman into the barn, draped a wool blanket over her shoulders, and, without thinking, removed the dagger from his belt.
It was the only thing of value he had left from his father's days in the cavalry, its silver handle scarred from years of war. "Keep it," Jonathan rasped, his voice nearly lost against the howl of wind, "until the storm clears." The woman's hands trembled as she held the blade, but the look she gave him then struck deeper than any weapon could. It was not the look of a stranger. It was the look of someone receiving a vow. Her lips parted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I will remember your name." Before he could ask hers, she had slipped into the darkness, vanishing like a ghost. Now, in the pale light of morning, Jonathan understood why 200 warriors stood outside his cabin. She was no lost wanderer, no nameless fugitive. She was Ioka, wife of Ironhawk, the fierce Apache chief whose people still resisted the U.S. cavalry with a fire that could not be quenched. The dagger he had given in mercy was not just a weapon. Among the Apache, it was a bond of sacred trust. And in their eyes, Jonathan had crossed into forbidden ground. The cabin door shuddered as a heavy fist struck wood. The sound rolled across the silence like thunder before the storm. Jonathan exhaled slowly, setting his jaw. He knew what waited outside was more than judgment. It was fate, come to collect its due. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The cabin door shuddered again under the weight of another knock, this one harder, more deliberate. Jonathan Hale let the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer, steadying his breath. Then, with the slow resolve of a man who had faced death before, he pulled the door wide and stepped onto the porch. The morning light glared off war paint and polished beads. The warriors stood in rows that seemed to ripple out toward the horizon. And at their center, a man stepped forward. He was taller than the rest, broad-shouldered, with a mantle of white wolf pelts draped across his chest. Eagle feathers crowned his dark hair, and his eyes, deep, unreadable, locked onto Jonathan with the weight of judgment itself. Even without being told, Jonathan knew who this was. The chief. The man's voice cut through the still air like a blade. "Jonathan Hale," he said in halting English, his tone steady, sharp, "do you know why we are here?" Jonathan squared his shoulders. His voice was rough from whiskey and desert dust, but he forced it steady. "No," he answered, though both men knew it was only half a truth. The chief's gaze narrowed, searching him the way a hawk studies its prey. "I am Ironhawk, leader of my people. The woman who came to your house last night." He paused, letting the silence bite. "She is my wife." The words fell like stones down a canyon, each echo heavier than the last. Jonathan's throat tightened. He could see her again in the storm, the trembling hands clutching his dagger, the defiance in her dark eyes, the whisper, "I will remember your name." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know," Jonathan said, voice low. "She was lost, exhausted. I gave her shelter, nothing more." Behind Ironhawk, the line of warriors shifted, murmurs rising like wind stirring dry grass. Their eyes burned with suspicion. To them, Jonathan's words sounded like excuses, a weak man's lie. Ironhawk raised a hand and the murmurs died instantly. His gaze remained fixed on Jonathan. "She did not return to our camp. And you," his voice deepened, soft but edged with steel, "you are the last man to see her alive." Jonathan's gut twisted. He had not chosen this storm, yet it had broken over him all the same. Alone, unarmed except for his worn revolver, he stood against 200 men ready to paint the desert with his blood. But what chilled him most was not the threat of death. It was the eyes of Ironhawk, eyes that carried both the fury of a chief and the anguish of a husband.
Jonathan drew a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew enough of war to understand this moment was more than an accusation. It was the first step into a storm that would test not only his strength, but the very meaning of mercy and loyalty. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The desert wind finally stirred, brushing sand against Jonathan's boots, carrying with it the sharp smell of horse sweat and leather. The Apache warriors stared at him with a silence heavier than words, waiting for their chief's judgment. Ironhawk's gaze drifted to Jonathan's side, to the empty sheath where a weapon once hung. His voice lowered, though it carried to every ear. "The dagger she held," he said, "it was yours." Jonathan stiffened. He admitted after a beat. "I gave it to her so she could defend herself."
"Nothing more." The line of warriors rippled with low voices, some sharp with anger, others in disbelief. One stepped forward, his braids swinging, his chest painted with crimson lines. He spat into the dirt. "Lies. Among our people, a woman takes a blade only from the one she trusts with her life. It is a vow, a bond that cannot be broken." Another warrior raised his spear and barked out in their tongue, his voice raw with fury. Jonathan could not understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. His mercy had been mistaken for betrayal. Ironhawk lifted his hand again, and the ranks fell silent, but their eyes did not soften. He stepped closer, close enough that Jonathan could see the faint scars that crossed his jaw, trophies of old battles. The chief's voice was low and cutting. "Do you know what you have done?" Jonathan clenched his jaw. His heart thudded against his ribs, but he forced his words steady. "I gave her shelter in a storm, that is all. Where I come from, it's not a crime to offer a hand to someone drowning." Ironhawk studied him, eyes narrowing, as though he could strip the truth from Jonathan's soul. "In your world, perhaps.
"But in ours, to place a weapon in her hand is to speak without words. You swore yourself to her protection. You tied your fate to hers." The words struck Jonathan harder than any fist. What had been an act of simple compassion was now twisted into something sacred, binding, dangerous. He thought of the way Ayoka had looked at him when she accepted the blade, eyes burning with both sorrow and defiance. Had she known what it meant? The chief's voice grew rougher. "And now she is gone. Do you see why my warriors are ready to spill your blood? They believe you have taken what is not yours. They believe you have dishonored me." Jonathan's fists curled at his sides. He had survived gunfire and saber charges, had buried wife and child beneath cold earth. And yet this moment, the weight of 200 eyes, the fury of a husband, pressed heavier than any battlefield. "I never meant dishonor," he said quietly. His throat was dry as the desert dust. "If I gave offense, it was through ignorance, not deceit. I would not betray a man's wife. Not then, not now, not ever." The silence after those words stretched, fragile as glass. Horses stamped the ground, spears gleamed in the rising sun. Jonathan knew he was standing on the edge of death itself, and that only the next breath, the next word, might decide whether he walked into it or bought himself one more hour of life. The standoff held until Ironhawk finally spoke, his tone edged with reluctant restraint. "You say you meant no dishonor," the chief said, his voice low but firm. "Then you will prove it. You will ride with us. Until my wife is found, your life is tied to hers." Jonathan felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. To ride with them meant more than leaving his cabin behind. It meant walking into the very heart of suspicion, surrounded by men who would rather see his scalp nailed to a post. But he knew he had little choice. Iron Hawk turned to his warriors, speaking swiftly in Apache. The murmur rose like fire through dry grass. Some argued, others snarled their disapproval. But when the chief raised his hand, silence fell like a hammer. "Bring him a horse," Iron Hawk commanded. Within moments, a bay stallion was led forward, its eyes flashing with nervous fire. Jonathan's gut tightened. He had not ridden in years, not since the days when the U.S. cavalry sent him across these very deserts.
As he swung into the saddle, memories surged like ghosts, cavalry boots pounding, bugles wailing, gun smoke rising over broken canyons. He remembered too clearly the fear in Apache eyes as soldiers stormed their camps. He remembered the flames, the cries of women and children caught in the chaos. It was war, they had told him then, duty. But standing here now, under the burning gaze of Apache warriors, those memories curdled into something far heavier. The war party set off at once, hooves thundering against the hard earth. Dust rose in choking clouds, the air alive with the rhythm of horses and the creak of leather. Jonathan rode among them, every eye on him like knives in his back. He felt the press of their judgment with each mile, as though he were a condemned man escorted to the gallows. Yet even in that grim company, the land itself drew his gaze. Towering cliffs of red stone loomed like ancient walls, carved by centuries of wind. Dry washes cut across the plains, their beds littered with the bones of cattle and wild mustangs. The scent of sage hung thick, mingling with sweat and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, its cry sharp against the endless sky. Jonathan's hands tightened on the reins. 10 years he had lived in silence, burying himself in chores and whiskey, pretending the world beyond his fence no longer mattered. But now, surrounded by warriors who despised him, his pulse beat with an old, dangerous energy. The rhythm of hooves stirred something long dormant in his chest. The soldier who had once lived and killed and bled in these very lands. Ironhawk rode at the front, never looking back. Yet Jonathan felt the chief's presence pressing against him like a storm. They were bound now, not by choice, but by fate. The search for Ioka had begun, and with it, a journey Jonathan knew would strip away every wall he had built around his heart. By nightfall, the war party made camp along a stream that trickled out from the cliffs. Horses were tethered, fires lit, and the smell of roasting venison soon mingled with the dust and smoke of the day. Jonathan sat apart, near the edge of the firelight, his back pressed against a cold boulder. Around him, the Apache moved with a discipline born of countless journeys. Some tended the flames, others sharpened blades or whispered in their tongue. Jonathan caught fragments of words he did not understand, though their tone was enough: mistrust, suspicion, the question of whether his life should end before dawn. And then the drums began, a steady, pulsing rhythm, low at first, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Voices rose, chanting in patterns older than memory. The sound rolled through the camp, weaving with the hiss of fire, the breath of horses, the rustle of cottonwood leaves. Jonathan felt the music seep into his bones, both foreign and hauntingly familiar, as though the desert itself were speaking. He had heard drums before, on battlefields, echoing from distant ridges before an attack. But these were different. They did not summon war, they summoned remembrance. He saw it in the faces of the warriors, the pride, the sorrow, the fierce love of a people bound together by blood and loss. Jonathan lowered his gaze to the fire, the flames licking upward like tongues of judgment. He thought of the 2 graves behind his cabin, the silence that had swallowed his life for a decade. For years he had told himself he was done with the world, done with trust, done with hope. But here, in the circle of strangers who might yet kill him, he felt something stir. Loneliness no longer wrapped him as tightly. In its place was a painful awareness that even in grief people found ways to sing, to remember, to endure. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply.
A verse rose unbidden, one his mother had taught him when he was a boy. Let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Galatians 6:9. The words lingered like a whisper in the dark. He had given Ioka shelter not because he expected anything in return, but because it was right. Perhaps that single act, so small in the storm, was the first good seed he had planted in 10 years. When Jonathan opened his eyes, he noticed Ironhawk across the fire, watching him. The chief's face was shadowed, unreadable, but his gaze did not carry the same raw fury as before. For the first time, there was something else, something closer to curiosity. Jonathan said nothing, he only nodded, a gesture small enough not to invite danger, but honest enough to be seen. Ironhawk did not reply, but after a long moment he turned back to the fire. It was not trust, not yet.
But it was not hatred either. And for a man who had lived a decade in silence, that shift felt like the faintest crack of dawn against a long, unbroken night. By morning, the camp was broken in silence, embers smothered beneath sand. The war party rode out once more, their shadows stretching long across the prairie as the sun climbed higher. Jonathan kept his place near the center, the weight of suspicion still pressing down on him like a yoke. Around noon, Ironhawk lifted his hand, halting the column. He swung down from his horse with a grace that belied his size and crouched low, fingers brushing the earth. Several warriors followed suit, scanning the ground with sharp eyes that had read trails since childhood. Jonathan dismounted, though his knees ached from the long ride. He stepped closer, ignoring the hostile glares of those who thought he had no right to be near their chief. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Ironhawk did not answer at first. Instead, he pointed to the ground. There, faint but clear in the dust, were the small impressions of a woman's feet. Ioka's tracks, dragging slightly as though she had stumbled. Beside them, heavier prints pressed deep, wider strides, the marks of a man. Jonathan's chest tightened. He crouched beside the chief, studying the scene with the trained eye of a former soldier. "She wasn't running from you," he murmured, almost to himself. "She was being hunted." A ripple went through the warriors who understood his words. Some exchanged wary glances. Others shook their heads. Ironhawk's eyes flicked toward him, sharp as a hawk's own. "Explain." Jonathan gestured at the tracks. "Her steps, they weave, falter." She kept looking over her shoulder. "And here," he pointed to the deeper prints, "whoever followed her was bigger, stronger. He wasn't guiding her, he was chasing her." The Apache chief studied the ground again, his expression unreadable. For a long time he said nothing. Then, at last, he gave a short nod. "You see what I see." It was the first acknowledgement Jonathan had received since this ordeal began. A small crack in the wall of suspicion, yet meaningful. For a man who had been silent company to his own ghosts for a decade, even the act of being heard felt like a kind of mercy. But Ironhawk's tone hardened again. "The trail is older than I hoped. Whoever has her moves quickly." He stood, his shadow long against the sun-scorched earth. "If we do not catch them before the mountains, we may never see her again." The words struck like the tolling of a clock. Time itself had become an enemy. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken, his soldier's instincts stirring once more. He had known the cruelty of delay, had seen men lost forever because help came a moment too late. He drew a steady breath, his voice rough but firm. "Then we ride harder." The warriors shifted, some still glaring, others glancing at their chief for guidance. Ironhawk looked at Jonathan one last time, and for the briefest instant there was no hatred there, only the shared urgency of two men bound to the same fate. And then the chief swung back onto his horse, raising his hand. The war party thundered north, chasing a trail that grew colder with every passing hour.
The war party pushed on into harsher country, where the land split into jagged ravines and the air shimmered with heat rising off red stone. The trail wound upward, forcing horses to scramble along narrow ledges. Dust clung to sweat-soaked skin, and every breath carried the taste of iron and sand. Jonathan kept his place in the column, silent under the watch of a dozen eyes. They gave him no chains, yet he felt their scrutiny heavier than any set of irons. Every stumble, every pause to wipe sweat, every glance toward the horizon was measured, judged. Late in the afternoon, when the horses were lathered and the warriors weary, one of the younger braves tossed Jonathan a water skin with a sharp grunt. He caught it, the leather slick in his calloused hands. For a moment he hesitated, uncertain if it was a gesture of contempt or acceptance. Then, slowly, he drank and handed it back. The young warrior did not smile, but neither did he sneer. Small tests followed. At the next halt, Jonathan was told to gather firewood. He did so without complaint, hauling thorny mesquite branches until his arms ached. When one of the horses spooked and pulled against its tether, Jonathan moved quickly, steadying the animal before it bolted down the slope. He had tended horses all his life. The skill came back as natural as breath. The warriors watched, their expressions unreadable. Some muttered in their tongue, shaking their heads. But others studied him more carefully now, as though measuring whether the old wolf of the ridge might yet prove himself useful. That night, Jonathan found himself sitting closer to the circle of fire than before. He said little, listening instead to the cadence of Apache voices, the low laughter, the stories told in flickers of flame and shadow. He understood few words, but he recognized the rhythm of fellowship, the bonds of a tribe. For 10 years, his nights had been drowned in whiskey and silence. But here, even in mistrust, he felt the faint pulse of life again. The smoke curled upward into a sky littered with stars, and for the first time in years, Jonathan did not feel entirely alone beneath them. He thought of Ayoka, the way her eyes had pierced him in the storm, the trembling hands clutching the dagger. She had not looked at him as a stranger. She had looked at him as if she believed he could still be a man of worth. Across the fire, Iron Hawk spoke in a low voice to his men. Jonathan could not make out the words, but when the chief's eyes lifted toward him, they held something new. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Jonathan inhaled deeply, the night air cool against his lungs. Somewhere inside, a thought rose unbidden, that perhaps God had not left him to die behind his fences after all. Perhaps mercy, so small a thing as opening a barn door in a storm, was leading him towards something greater. And as the fire crackled, Jonathan realized a truth he had not felt in years. He was alive. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The canyon was narrow as a rifle barrel, its red cliffs towering high on both sides. The air was still, too still, and the silence pressed on Jonathan's chest like a weight. He had ridden through places like this before, back in his soldiering days, and the lesson was always the same. When the world grows quiet, danger is already upon you. He scanned the ridges above, his instincts prickling. The Apache warriors rode ahead, their painted faces set in grim focus. Ironhawk led at the front, his presence steady as stone, though Jonathan caught the faint twitch of his shoulders, as if the chief too felt the air tighten. The first arrow came like lightning. It whistled past Jonathan's ear and struck hard into the canyon wall. A heartbeat later, the world exploded. From both sides of the cliffs, shadows erupted, men pouring out with war cries that shook the stones. Arrows rained down in a storm, spears hurled from above, ricocheting off rock with sharp clangs. "Ambush!" someone roared. The canyon became chaos. Horses screamed and bucked, warriors dove for cover, and dust rose thick as smoke. Jonathan's hand moved without thought. He slid from the saddle, hitting the ground hard, rolling toward a boulder as another arrow shattered against the stone behind him. For the first time in years, his body remembered the old rhythm. Breathe steady, find cover, keep moving. He pulled the rifle from its scabbard, checked the chamber, and peered around the edge of rock.
His eyes, trained long ago in the crucible of war, cut through the haze. On the ridge above, a figure leaned with a bow, taking aim at Iron Hawk. Jonathan raised the rifle, the wood snug against his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked, echoing across the canyon. The bowman toppled backward in silence, swallowed by the dust.
Ironhawk's eyes flicked toward him briefly. Acknowledgement, nothing more, before the chief barked orders in his tongue, rallying his men. The Apaches wheeled into action, their arrows flying upward in fierce arcs. But the enemy was many, too many. Jonathan ducked as a spear shattered against the stone beside him. Splinters stung his cheek. He gritted his teeth, reloaded, and fired again, feeling the old fire burn in his veins. For 10 years he had lived behind fences, shutting out the world, a man already half dead. Now, crouched in dust and blood, he felt alive in a way that terrified and exhilarated him. The roar of battle was no longer just noise, it was a summons. The canyon walls shook with the violence of it. Dust, blood, and gunpowder mingled in the air. Jonathan knew there was no retreat now. The trail behind was sealed with enemies, the way forward choked with blades. The ambush had snapped shut like the jaws of a wolf. This was the point of no return. The canyon raged with chaos, shouts, war cries, and the endless thrum of arrows striking rock. Jonathan pressed his back to the stone, his rifle hot in his hands. He reloaded with fingers that moved faster than thought, the rhythm of battle long buried now rising from the grave of memory. He peered up the cliffside. Most of the ambushers fired wildly, rushing from rock to rock in their frenzy, but one figure stood out. The man was calm, too calm, his face half-shadowed beneath paint. He didn't loose arrows like the others. Instead, his hands flicked through sharp, deliberate gestures toward the attackers above, signals, swift and precise. Jonathan's stomach knotted. He knew the language of war. Hand signals were the tongue of soldiers, not panicked raiders. The man was not fighting. He was guiding. Betrayal. A surge of anger shot through him, hot as fire. For a split second, he thought of staying silent. Let the tribe tear itself apart. After all, this wasn't his war. But then his eyes fell to Iron Hawk. The chief stood firm amid the storm, his bow singing, his commands cutting through the air like a drumbeat. The warriors looked to him, trusted him. If he fell, all of them would die. Jonathan clenched his jaw, his decision made. He rose from behind the boulder, his voice cutting across the canyon. "Iron Hawk, look there, on the ridge!"
"One of your own guides them." For a heartbeat, everything seemed to freeze. Arrows still hissed, dust still swirled, but Ironhawk's eyes snapped to where Jonathan pointed. His face hardened like stone, and in a blink his bow bent. The traitor turned, shock flashing across his painted features. Too late. Ironhawk's arrow flew with a scream like a hawk's cry. It struck deep into the man's shoulder, hurling him backward. The signal stopped. A ripple tore through the enemy ranks. Confusion spread, their attack faltering without the traitor's silent guidance. Jonathan felt the shift immediately. The chaos was still deadly, but the tide had cracked. He fired again, the rifle's crack rolling like thunder. A raider dropped from the ledge, another tumbled down the rocks. The Apaches roared, rallying. Their arrows cut sharper, their charges struck harder. Ironhawk's voice rose, fierce and unrelenting, a battle hymn born from fury and betrayal. Jonathan ducked back as an arrow shattered against the stone above him. His breath came ragged, his hands raw, but he grinned despite himself. The old instincts had returned. Not just the soldier, but the survivor.
And yet, behind the thrill of battle, a truth gnawed at him. This wasn't just a random raid. Someone had planned this ambush, placed a traitor among the Apache, and chosen this canyon for slaughter. The enemy's aim wasn't simply blood, it was destruction. Jonathan's gut told him this was only the beginning. The traitor's body crashed down the rocky slope, his cry swallowed by the thunder of battle. For a breath, the canyon seemed to hold still, every warrior, Apache and enemy alike, staring at the fallen man.
Then the silence shattered. The ambushers faltered, hesitation creeping into their charge. Iron Hawk seized the moment. His voice rose like a battle horn. "For the people! For the land!" The warriors roared in answer, driving forward with renewed ferocity. Arrows streaked the air, spears thrust with deadly precision, and the canyon rang with the sound of defiance. Jonathan pressed against the boulder, his rifle smoking in his grip. He fired again, cutting down a raider who had broken through the line. His heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, not since the battlefields of the Civil War. The man who had once sworn he'd never fight again now found himself shoulder to shoulder with a people not his own, standing in their defense. Iron Hawk moved like a storm, loosing arrows with impossible speed, his eyes burning with fury. But even the strongest warrior was not untouchable. Jonathan's sharp gaze caught it, a shadow slipping through the chaos, a spear poised high, its deadly point aimed straight for the Apache chief's back. "Iron Hawk!" Jonathan roared. Without thinking, without hesitation, he threw himself from behind the rock. His boots slammed against the dust as he sprinted forward, rifle raised. He fired. The shot cracked like lightning. The raider stumbled, the spear flying from his grip, falling harmlessly against the canyon floor. Iron Hawk turned, eyes wide, meeting Jonathan's stare. For a heartbeat, two men, enemies by birth, strangers by blood, looked upon one another as brothers forged in fire. Jonathan's chest heaved, the acrid smoke of his rifle filling his lungs. A strange calm washed over him. In that moment, a verse his mother used to whisper came unbidden to his mind, steady and sure. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." John 15:13. He had not thought himself capable of such love again, not after losing his wife and son, not after burying his heart in whiskey and silence. Yet here, in this canyon of blood and dust, he knew he would do it without question. The battle raged on, the clash of steel and the cries of men echoing against the cliffs. But something had shifted. Jonathan was no longer merely surviving, no longer the reluctant wanderer dragged into another people's war. He had chosen. Iron Hawk lifted his bow in salute, his voice cutting through the storm. "Jonathan Ward fights with the heart of an Apache." The warriors rallied once more, their strength surging. The canyon, moments ago a place of certain death, now trembled with the possibility of victory. But Jonathan knew the cost of war too well. One battle might be won, but the true storm still waited beyond the horizon. The canyon was still thick with smoke, arrows quivering from rock and earth, bodies scattered like broken branches after a storm. The cries of the wounded mingled with the uneasy snort of horses, their nostrils steaming in the cooling air. Jonathan wiped the grit and blood from his brow, his rifle hanging loose in his hand. The Apache warriors moved among the fallen, checking their wounded, murmuring prayers to the spirits. For a brief moment, silence settled, a fragile pause between storms. Then a low groan drew Jonathan's eyes. The traitor. The man lay crumpled at the canyon's edge, blood pooling beneath him, his breath ragged and shallow. Yet his eyes still burned with a cruel fire. Jonathan strode forward, boots crunching over the dust, and knelt beside him. "Where is she?" Jonathan demanded, his voice harsh, low. "Where have they taken Ayoka?" The traitor's lips twisted, blood seeping between his teeth. He coughed, then let out a broken laugh, a sound colder than the desert night. "You think you saved her?" His voice was a rasping whisper. "Fool, she is bait." Jonathan's stomach clenched. His hand tightened around the man's torn tunic. "What do you mean?" The traitor's eyes flickered upward, filled with both hatred and grim satisfaction. "The valley of horse bones. They wait for you there." "For Iron Hawk, for all of you."
Jonathan's breath caught. His mind raced back to whispers he'd overheard by the campfire, stories of a cursed valley where an entire cavalry had once been swallowed by a storm, their bones left to bleach beneath the sun, a place shunned even by the bravest of the Apache. The man's breath rattled, but his words came sharp as knives. They don't just want her. They want the tribe. They want the chief. They want an ending. Ironhawk appeared at Jonathan's side, his shadow falling long across the dying man. His jaw was set, but his eyes burned with restrained fury. "Why betray your own blood?" the chief demanded. The traitor's lips curved into a final, bitter grin. "Power always hungers, and some of your own feed it." A shudder tore through him. His body went still, eyes glazing into emptiness. The canyon held its breath again. Jonathan slowly rose to his feet, the weight of the revelation pressing on his chest. He turned to Ironhawk, his voice grim. "They want to lure us in. They mean to destroy you, your whole people, where fear already poisons the ground." Ironhawk's face hardened like carved stone. For a moment he said nothing, his eyes lost in the horizon beyond the canyon walls. Then he spoke, low but resolute. "Then we ride into the valley, not as prey, as hunters." Jonathan felt the old, familiar ache in his heart, the cost of war, the stench of betrayal, the inevitability of sacrifice. Yet even as fear gnawed at him, another truth rose steady within. This was no longer another man's fight. This was his battle, too. The following dawn broke pale and gray, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise. The Apache warriors rode in silence, their faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed ahead. The desert stretched wide and merciless around them, but in their hearts lay a greater weight, the valley of horse bones. Jonathan rode near Ironhawk, the hoofbeats of his horse echoing like a drum in his chest. He had heard whispers from the men around the campfire that the valley was cursed ground, where an entire cavalry troop had once vanished in a sandstorm so fierce it stripped flesh from bone. The earth had kept their remains as a warning. Their ghosts were said to wander still, whispering madness to those who dared enter. Even the warriors, seasoned by countless battles, tightened their grips on their weapons as they neared. Some whispered prayers in their tongue, others tied feathers to their spears for protection. Jonathan's gaze fell to the ground. Scattered bones, bleached white by decades of sun, littered the sand. Horse skulls stared up at the riders with hollow eyes, their teeth bared in eternal screams. The wind howled through the cliffs, carrying with it a sound like distant cries. The men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Ironhawk lifted his voice, deep and steady, though Jonathan could hear the steel edge of defiance in it. "Fear is their weapon. They believe this place will break us before the battle begins. But we ride not as shadows, we ride as fire." The warriors let out a sharp cry of agreement, though the fear in their eyes did not vanish. Jonathan felt his own chest tighten. His soldier's instincts warned him that walking into an enemy's chosen ground was folly. Yet another voice rose inside him, quieter, deeper. Not the voice of strategy, but of faith. He closed his eyes briefly, clutching the worn leather reins. In the stillness of his heart, words came unbidden, a verse long buried yet never forgotten. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Psalm 23:4. The words steadied him. He opened his eyes, the bones no longer only a symbol of doom, but also a reminder of the countless who had walked into death before. And yet here he was, alive, chosen somehow to ride again. The trail narrowed into a canyon throat, jagged cliffs looming high, their shadows swallowing the rider's whole. Jonathan glanced upward. Every stone outcropping looked like a place for an ambush. His hand brushed the rifle at his side.
Ironhawk raised his arm, signaling for silence. The column slowed, the only sounds the crunch of hooves on gravel and the eerie whistle of the wind. Ahead, faint drag marks scarred the sand, signs of struggle, the marks of a body pulled unwillingly forward. Jonathan's throat tightened. "Ioka," the warriors murmured. Some glanced skyward, muttering prayers against the spirits said to dwell here. But Jonathan leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes sharp, his heart pounding with resolve. The valley was cursed, yes, but curses were powerless against truth, against faith, against courage. And somewhere within its bones, Ioka waited. The sun dipped low, turning the valley of horsebones into a furnace of red and gold. The wind carried with it the rattle of bones clashing against one another, as though the ghosts of the dead cavalry rose to watch. At the far end of the valley, bound to a weathered wooden post, stood Ioka. Her long, dark hair whipped wildly in the hot wind, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes still burned with fire. Around her circled the traitors, Apache men who had turned against their own blood, their weapons glinting like fangs in the dying light. Ironhawk reined in his horse, his jaw set like iron. The line of loyal warriors fanned out behind him, their spears bristling. A hush fell across the valley, heavy and suffocating. Then came the voice, a deep, mocking shout from the traitors' leader. "Lay down your weapons, White Hawk. Kneel, and perhaps your wife will live to see another sunrise. Resist, and her blood stains this cursed sand before your eyes." The words echoed off the cliffs like a death sentence. Ironhawk's knuckles whitened around his spear.
But before he could answer, Jonathan urged his horse forward. He rode into the no-man's land between the two sides, his weathered coat flapping, his gray eyes fixed on the traitors. The men sneered, hurling insults, but Jonathan did not flinch. His voice rang out, rough but steady, cutting through the wind. "You are mistaken. This woman is not just the wife of a chief. She is a symbol of loyalty, of the bond that cannot be bought or betrayed. And if you spill her blood, you destroy not just her, but the honor of every man who still calls himself Apache." A silence fell so sharp that even the bones seemed to listen. Ironhawk's gaze snapped to Jonathan, his eyes flashing with something between shock and respect. The traitor snarled, "Then you will die first, old man." With a cry, they surged forward. The valley erupted in chaos. Arrows streaked through the air, spears clashed against shields, and the war cries of men shook the ground. Jonathan leapt from his horse, his rifle already raised. He fired, cutting down a warrior rushing for Ioka. Then another came from the side, and Jonathan swung the rifle stock like a club, the crack echoing off stone. Through the storm of battle, Jonathan's eyes never left the wooden post. He fought like a man possessed, not for glory, not even for survival, but for a promise he had made in a stormy night, that he would not turn away from someone in need. At last he reached her. With a roar, he drew the dagger, the same blade he had once placed in her trembling hands. The steel flashed, severing the ropes. Ioka collapsed forward, into his arms. Her lips trembled, her eyes fierce even in exhaustion. "I knew you would come." Behind them, Ironhawk's spear struck true, felling the traitor leader. The rebels faltered, their courage breaking. One by one they dropped their weapons, defeated not only by force, but by the unyielding fire of loyalty they could never extinguish. Jonathan held Ioka close, the weight of the valley pressing around him, the bones, the ghosts, the history. Yet in that moment, beneath the setting sun, he felt something else, a stirring of grace. And in his heart he recalled the words, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." John 15:13. The battle was over.
But Jonathan Ward was no longer the forgotten rancher of the prairie.
He was a man reborn in fire, bound now not by solitude, but by brotherhood. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The valley lay quiet at last. Smoke still clung to the air, curling upward from spent torches and smoldering brush. The ground was littered with broken arrows and shattered spears, grim reminders of the chaos that had thundered only moments before. But now the cries of battle had faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of drums echoing against the stone walls. The Apache were singing. It was not the war cry of defiance that Jonathan had first heard when they surrounded his ranch. This song was different, low, steady, rising like the heartbeat of the earth itself. A hymn of survival, of honor reclaimed. The warriors moved in a circle, their chants rising with the beat of rawhide drums. In the center, fires crackled, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Jonathan stood at the edge of it all, his body sore and weary, his rifle heavy in his hands. He had fought with everything in him, and yet, as he watched the people before him, he realized the battle had never been his alone. It was their battle, their survival, their unity. And somehow he had been swept into the heart of it. Ironhawk approached slowly, his frame tall and steady, his face carved with the weight of both grief and pride. For a long moment he simply looked at Jonathan, the rancher who had once been a stranger, an intruder. Then, before all his warriors, Ironhawk extended his hand. "You stood when others would have fled," the chief said, his voice carrying like thunder. "You bled for my people, and you freed my wife. From this night forward, Jonathan Ward is no longer a man alone on the prairie. You are my brother." The warriors raised their voices in approval, a sound that shook Jonathan to his core. He felt a weight settle on his shoulders, yet it was not the weight of loneliness, but of belonging. Ioka stepped forward, her face pale but strong, her dark eyes steady on him. In her hand she carried a silver necklace, its pendant carved in the shape of a crow. The firelight glimmered across its curves. "This is mine," she said softly. "I would never surrender it unless I had no choice. Tonight I give it freely, to you, not as a debt, but as a bond." The warriors raised their voices in approval, a sound that shook Jonathan to his core. He felt a weight settle on his shoulders, yet it was not the weight of loneliness, but of belonging. Ioka stepped forward, her face pale but strong, her dark eyes steady on him. In her hand she carried a silver necklace, its pendant carved in the shape of a crow. The firelight glimmered across its curves. "This is mine," she said softly. "I would never surrender it unless I had no choice. Tonight I give it freely, to you, not as a debt, but as a bond."
A reminder that in the storm you chose mercy when you could have turned away. Her words struck him harder than any blade. Jonathan's rough hands trembled as she placed the necklace into his palm. Its cold weight seemed to burn, as if carrying both the sorrow of his past and the promise of something more. For a long time he said nothing. His mind drifted to the graves on the hillside, the wife and child he had buried years ago, the endless nights he had spent drowning in whiskey and silence. He had thought grief would be his only companion until death. Yet here, among the fires and the songs of a people not his own, he felt the faint stirrings of something he had long forgotten: hope. He closed his fist around the necklace and whispered, almost to himself, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." Psalm 35. The words rolled off his tongue like a prayer, steady and sure. And as he looked around, the warriors, the chief, the woman he had saved, Jonathan knew that morning had come at last.
He lifted his eyes to Iron Hawk, then to Ioka, and for the first time in years he allowed a faint smile to crease his weathered face.
Not the hollow smirk of a man trying to mask pain, but the true, weary smile of someone who had found a reason to stand again. The drums thundered louder, the people sang, their voices rising to the stars. And in the midst of them, Jonathan Ward, once the forgotten wolf of the prairie, was no longer forgotten at all. Night settled deep across the valley of Horsebones. The fires still burned, their glow dancing across the canyon walls. But the songs of victory had softened. Some warriors rested against their saddles, others mended wounds in silence. The battle was over, yet its weight still lingered in the air like smoke. Jonathan sat apart from the circle, close enough to feel the warmth of the flames, but still at the edge of their gathering. Old habits died hard. For years he had lived as an outsider, watching from doorways, listening from shadows, speaking only when pressed. And yet tonight was different. Tonight he was not outside looking in. Iron Hawk passed him once, giving a short nod of respect. Ioka too lingered by the fire, her silver hair ornament catching the glow, her gaze meeting Jonathan's with quiet gratitude. Each small gesture reminded him he had crossed a line he could never uncross, and strangely, he no longer wished to. Jonathan stared into the flames, the silver crow pendant heavy in his hand. The fire cracked and hissed, carrying sparks upward into the black sky. He thought of the storm that had brought Ioka to his barn, the dagger he had pressed into her palm, and the chain of events that followed. He thought of the graves on his ranch, the years he had wasted in silence. Could it all truly be more than chance? His chest tightened. Slowly, Jonathan bowed his head. No words rose to his lips, only a silence that was heavier, deeper, more sacred than any prayer he had ever spoken. Yet within that silence, his heart spoke clearly. "Thank you, Lord, for not forgetting me, even when I had forgotten you." The wind shifted through the canyon, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and ash. Jonathan breathed deeply, as though the night itself were filling him with strength. He had not prayed in years, but now every breath felt like a prayer. The chief's warriors spoke in their tongue, recounting the courage of the fight, naming their fallen, and praising their survival.
Jonathan did not understand every word, but he understood their meaning. Belonging was not about blood or birthplace. It was about the bond forged in fire and sacrifice. As he sat, he felt the weight of his years of exile lift, little by little, like chains falling away. He realized something profound. Saving Ioka had saved more than her life. It had saved his own soul. His eyes stung, but he did not turn away. Instead, he lifted them to the dark horizon where dawn would soon break. He whispered into the night a verse long buried in memory. "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Isaiah 40:31. The words steadied him. They were not mere scripture anymore. They were his truth. For the first time in a decade, Jonathan Ward felt strong again. Strong enough to live, strong enough to belong, strong enough to believe. The Apache drums began once more, slow and deep, like the pulse of the earth. Iron Hawk gestured for Jonathan to join the circle. For a moment, the rancher hesitated, old fears tugging at him.
But then he rose, clutching the crow pendant against his chest, and stepped into the firelight. Ioka moved aside, making space for him beside her. Iron Hawk welcomed him with a firm nod. And just like that, Jonathan Ward, the loner once forgotten by the world, sat among the people of the White Crow, no longer a stranger. As the firelight bathed his weathered face, Jonathan smiled. Not the smile of a man pretending, but of one reborn. He had entered the storm alone, but he would leave it with a family, a purpose, and a faith restored.
In the heart of the Wild West, where death rode the horizon and storms tore the sky, Jonathan had learned a truth no bullet could erase. Kindness does not only save another's life, sometimes it saves your own. Perhaps, friend, as you listened to Jonathan's journey, you felt a part of your own story reflected in his. We all know the storms that strip us bare, the nights of silence when hope feels distant, and the weight of mistakes that seem too heavy to lay down. Yet just as the loner rancher found mercy in the most unlikely of places, so too can we discover that one act of kindness, whether given or received, can change everything.
This tale is not only about the frontier, but about the human heart, its capacity to endure loss, to rediscover faith, and to find belonging again. If this story stirred something in you, I invite you to walk with me further. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and let us keep alive the true Wild West stories where faith, courage, and compassion are never forgotten.